tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We have in studio with us J.J. Jasper, and it's going to be a very challenging, but I hope very encouraging program as we talk about his book, Losing Cooper, Finding Hope to Grieve Well. For those of you that listen on the American Family Radio Network, you already know who this man is because he has been the morning show radio personality for years and years. For many of you that maybe have had him come to your church, you know him as a comedian and as a motivational speaker. Some of you perhaps have seen some of his previous books. One that I think is so much fun. Moses was a basket case, even had a children's book, When I Grow Up. But this one's going to be a little bit different because it tells the story of the loss of his son. But I think it will be a real encouragement to those of you that maybe are facing some kind of loss. And we want to talk about how some of these resources we're going to be talking about today can be helpful to you. But J.J. Jasper, saw you last week in Tupelo, Mississippi. Now you've come to join me here in Dallas, Texas.
Oh, this is great. Thank you so much, Kirby. And I have to say I have enjoyed Point of View many years ago listening to Marlon Maddox, and now you at the helm, and you're just doing a super job. So thank you so much. This is an honor and a privilege.
Well, we certainly want to spend some time getting to know you, and it is some respects going to be a sad commentary. There's no way we're going to make it through this next hour without crying, and there will be tears because we're going to talk about the loss of your son, who just was an incredible young man, and I've had a chance to hear you talk about him. I've had a chance to read about this in the book, but he never seemed to go through the terrible twos. He seemed to be just maybe our next, I don't know, Billy Graham or something like that. He just had a real heart for the Lord. But what we're going to spend most of our time talking about is that accident and then the process of dealing with grief. And I'm hoping that this will be a real encouragement to our listeners. So tell us a little bit of the story. I mean, it is a sad story, but that's where we have to begin.
Well, my wife Melanie and our life was marked by ministry and travel, a strong marriage, wonderful church home, lots of great friends, and our daughters. We had 4 daughters and our little boy, and we just, some days I felt like a boy Cinderella. I just wanted to pinch myself because our life was just so charmed. And then in 2008, we had bought a small horse and cattle farm. In 2008, on March the 14th, my father-in-law, he found out he had cancer. After several weeks, he passed away. My wife's a daddy's girl. That was just devastating. He was larger than life. But then a few weeks later, on Easter Sunday morning, Melanie had a miscarriage. So March, my father-in-law passes away. A few weeks later, a miscarriage. And then that same year, I had a near-fatal horseback riding accident.
Yeah.
In the hospital 49 days, 7 days in intensive care. You wives and mothers listening, Melanie had to talk with the doctors and nurses and then do double duty at home. So our consolation in 2008, Kirby, we said, well, at least the worst is behind us. We had really never had any real difficulties. And we said there's nothing that could ever compare to how horrible and terrible this year has been. Well, 2009, I'm coming back from a trip in Denver, missing my wife and children, sent Melanie to the store because she had been there with the children. And it was a Friday. The sky was blue. And Cooper, we decided to go and ride in our dune buggy. And just a father and a son making memories, a daddy and his boy. And this was a an oversized go-kart or a small dune buggies, low to the ground, full roll cage, padded roll bars, and he was buckled in, and we were going up and down the dirt lane on our farm and just laughing and just having so much fun. July the 17th, 2009. And then after we were through riding, I was just going to do what we always called a donut. I'm going to turn the wheel, spin around, head back to the house. I turned the wheel, I spun around, and then something went terribly wrong.
Yes.
The dune buggy flopped over, and he was buckled in. I was not, and it threw me out. And I can remember it like it was yesterday. When I hit the ground, the first thing that came to my mind, I thought, oh, if I put a scratch on Coop, if I broke his little arm, I'll never be able to forgive myself.
Yes.
And I walked over a few feet, the dune buggy lying on its side, he's still buckled in. And in the rollover, just a freak accident, in the rollover, it had broken his little neck. And our only son, my best friend, my little buddy, he died in my arms July the 17th, 2009. And then all of those words like shock and denial and horror and that it's just a surreal moment, all of those things came into play because it really is every parent's worst nightmare. The unthinkable happened to us, Kirby, and that's only by the grace of God were we able to make it through that.
You know, when I first heard the story, of course, I've also heard about Stephen Curtis Chapman, and of course, he does an endorsement of the book as well. And of course, anybody that knows that story, that's where his son was backing out and then ended up killing their other adopted daughter. And I remember at the time, interestingly enough, as they're driving to the hospital, he's yelling out to his son, "It's not your fault." Of course, your wife did not know anything had happened until she shows up, and she was nice enough to look at you in the face and say, "It's not your fault. It was an accident." But that, of course, stayed with you for quite some time, didn't it?
You're exactly right. My wife, Melanie, is amazing. And repeatedly, over and over, when I would have meltdowns, she said, "I know how much you loved our son. You would lay down your life for him. This is not something that was planned. You were careful. We were always extra careful with our children." And she would just say over and over, "It's an accident." But, you know, guilt knows no boundaries. And it's just that the guilt and the depression and just the deep, deep sorrow, there's really not a graph to measure the pain. Kirby, it's unnatural to bury your children. In fact, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but a woman whose husband dies, they call her a widow, a child whose parents die, they're an orphan. There's not even a label for parents whose
lost
children.
a child.
Yeah. And it's just so terrible and it's so awful and it's just it's out of order. It's unnatural. But by God's grace, we're still standing. In fact, you know, the next few days and weeks, we just stumbled forward and every day our routine, Melanie and I, as soon as our eyes would open, we would hold each other, we'd sob uncontrollably, and then we would pray over and over the same prayer, "Lord, help us grieve well. Lord, help us grieve well." And we just prayed that over and over. We didn't even know what that looked like or what that meant, but we didn't want to plunge over the cliff. We didn't want to go off the deep end. And then we'd get our wits together and go downstairs where we had a wonderful support group of family and friends. And just as anyone can imagine, you're just in a fog. You're in a daze for days and weeks. So we had a lot of help.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're not only going to talk about this book, Losing Cooper, Finding Hope to Grieve Well, but we'll tell the story about creating this DVD called Flame On, a true story of hope in the midst of great personal tragedy. And I really want you to pay attention to this because, first of all, if you have lost a loved one, these resources are going to be very helpful to you. If you know somebody that has lost a loved one, I would hope that you might want to get some of those and pass them on. And we have a link to your website, jjjasper.com, where people can even get bulk copies of this. And I know individuals that have actually obtained these to take their church through a grief process or through various kinds of counseling. So we are seeing this today as not only a very powerful story, but some resources that could be very helpful to you. So let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with J.J. Jasper. A little bit later, we'll open up the phones in case you have a comment or a question. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, one of the many dividing lines between progressives and conservatives is their belief in the efficiency and effectiveness of government bureaucracies. Liberals may have some misgivings about how they are treated at the Department of Motor Vehicles or by the TSA at airports. Nevertheless, they tend to believe that government is the solution to most social and political problems. Conservatives are usually more skeptical about government and support the private sector over the public sector. But their reactions seem tempered by the fact that they generally have high respect for people in the military and law enforcement. It's this difference in perspective concerning federal bureaucracies that shows up in many debates, including the current one about vetting refugees and other immigrants. In a recent column, Kevin Williamson asked, who seriously thinks that our public institutions are up to the job of properly investigating tens of thousands of refugees, asylum seekers, and ordinary immigrants every year? If Donald Trump's temporary order seems to you unreasonable, ask yourself what the next best option is and how much confidence we should have in it. When I read or hear someone assure us that the government screening of refugees and immigrants is very effective, I want to ask them some questions. Have you been to the DMV or the VA recently? Have you visited an immigration office recently? Sometimes you find a well-run organization, but far too often you probably walked out of a government building shaking your head because it was hardly run efficiently and effectively. Add to this the reality that the information from some of these countries for these refugees and immigrants is sketchy at best. That is why I think some are more trusting of the federal bureaucracy than is warranted. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again in studio with me today, J.J. Jasper, and many of you on American Family Radio have a chance to hear him, but now all of you get a chance to get to know him a little bit better. Because he's in studio, don't forget you can not only listen to the program, but you might want to watch the program. You can go to pointofview.net and see what is happening in the studio. And the book Losing Cooper is endorsed by, of course, Tim Wildman, president of American Family Association, Max Lucado, Rich Bott, Janet Parshall, Stephen Kendrick, who is the author of Love Dare and producer of Courageous, which we're going to talk about just a little bit later in the broadcast, Dr. Robert Jeffress. It's kind of a who's who of everybody we've had on the program, and everybody just endorses the book. And the book is available through your website and in other places, and there's both a hardback and a paperback, but there's bulk copies. And I know that there are various people going through recoveries, grief recovery, counseling programs, and you didn't write this as a counseling book, but you've had counselors come up and say, I couldn't have written it any better if I tried to pull in all the principles we've learned about biblical counseling and put it into the book.
That's what we're hearing. Counselors are using this in grief recovery, and we've noticed a pattern that they're buying it in bulk. It's hugely discounted. And then we're noticing that with all of the notes that we're receiving, I don't think a day has gone by since the book came out several months back that we haven't heard from someone that said, this helped me start the grief process. This helped me turn a corner, and they just say thank you, and they mention their favorite chapter. But they talk about how God is using this as a resource, and I guess the subtitle tells it all: Losing Cooper, Finding Hope to Grieve Well. And everyone knows where they see an example of someone who plunges into drug or alcohol addiction, or they just get paralyzed by bitterness. And so we just wanted to offer a blueprint to say you can start from where you are right now and get to the place where you can say, I'm grieving well.
Well, if we talk about one of those problems, that is a couple that loses a child have a very high percentage of ending up in divorce. And I've seen this time and time again. Now, you and I both share something in common. We married over our abilities.
Yes.
We outkicked our coverage.
Yes, we
and
did.
You have a wonderful wife. But still, in the midst of some of this, people were saying, you and your wife were doing very well. Would you be willing to put this on a DVD? And I'll hold up for our listeners right now, the ones watching. There is this DVD called Flame On, and you can explain why it's titled that. But this has been as much of a benefit, maybe even more so, than the book itself. Talk about that.
We, as you mentioned, work for American Family Association, American Family Radio, morning co-host, and the Wildman family. So grateful for Don Wildman, Tim Wildman, the entire Wildman family. They have a heart for faith, family, and freedom. They approached us only a couple months into our grief, and they said, we've noticed that you haven't turned to drugs or alcohol. You're still going to church. You're not bitter or angry at God, and your marriage is still strong. Kirby, I did not know at the time that up to 89% of marriages fail when there's the death of a small child. So when you hear of a child that drowns, when you hear of a child that gets in traffic and gets killed, please rally around that family because the statistics are not good.
Not good.
So they were not trying to exploit us, and they were very ginger. They said, if and when you're able to do this, your story needs to be told. And they said, the reason we want to do it now, we want to capture the grief in real time instead of 10, 20 years down the road to do this documentary. Well, we prayerfully agreed to do it. In the bonus tracks, Dr. James Dobson helped out, Dr. David Jeremiah, the Kendrick brothers. And here was the thing. They said, we want to do this. Number one, we want to give it away and not sell it. And number two, we just want to offer hope to hurting people. So we've given away over 50,000 copies. Over 100,000 people have seen it online. In fact, you can go to jjjasper.com and see it online. And we have heard from so many people. It's just, we're staggered by the avalanche of people. They've shown it at churches on Wednesday and Sunday night. My wife got a text once from a pastor's wife, hey, we're on vacation. We've come off the beach. We're back in the room. We're in the Caribbean. They're showing Flame On television in the Caribbean. We know they've shown it in India. It's been shown on TV in South Korea. So it's ricocheting around the globe, and we don't have any restrictions on it. Make copies, give it away, show it any way you want. We just wanted to offer that as a gift to try to help hurting people.
One of the people that saw that DVD is Max Lucado, who sat in that chair a couple of times in the studio here. And that caused him, number one, to give you a platform. But then he actually tells your story in one of his books.
Max Lucado told someone it was one of the most inspiring videos he's ever seen. He invited me to join him and Sheila Walsh for a radio special, reached out again and said, can I include your story in a sermon series? Then he asked if he could share our story in his amazing book, You'll Get Through This. So, yeah, when you get Max Lucado, you have a story that inspires and moves him. You know that God is up to something.
Well, something else developed out of that as well, and anybody that has seen the movie Courageous, which I have, but I didn't know the backstory, which you're going to now share with all of our listeners. The Kendrick brothers actually had a chance to hear that story, and when it came time to write part of that script, they thought, why don't we go to somebody that has actually lost a child, understands what it's like, so that the dialogue seems real and authentic. And so it turns out that a lot of your story ends up in that movie. True?
The Kendrick brothers, for those of you that know their movies, Facing the Giants, Flywheel, Fireproof, you're exactly right. They reached out to us and they said, we're writing the script. A small child dies. We don't know what that looks like. We want it to be genuine and authentic. If and when you're able, can you help? So we volunteered, worked behind the scenes, and when they finished the script, Stephen called me and he said, hey, I want you to know that we were able to build several scenes, due to our conversations. And I said, well, that's nice. You were able to get a couple of lines for the dad in the movie. He said, it just went over your head what I said. We built entire scenes per our conversation. And if this movie circles the globe like the others have, just know that Cooper's fingerprints are going to be all over it. So, someone listening right now and you've lost a loved one and you go, this is just a big zero, that this is just a scorched earth, ground zero thing going on. Not even God can get any good out of this. He's such a redeemer. He can take those ashes and bring beauty from ashes, and he was able to do that. So yes, we had a little bit of behind the scenes influence on the movie Courageous.
People have probably misused Romans 8:28 as a verse. It's probably been misused, misapplied, and everything else. But for just a minute, sometimes all things can work together for good. And you think of the impact that Cooper is having, even in his death, through, as we talked about here, this video, through this book, through this movie. And one more thing, you've got a Cooper Jasper Foundation. There are some really positive things that have come out of this incredible tragedy.
Well, when you ask about the family, I want to back up and say that little blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy with a dimple who is always laughing, always smiling. We love our daughters. They're remarkable. But Cooper was a very special boy. I've never seen anyone more grateful. He was always smiling, always helpful, always thoughtful. He won all the awards, and we just knew that God had a plan for him. It turned out to be an entirely different plan than we thought, but he's getting much glory from that little blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy's life.
Well, let me take a break, and let me open up the phones, because in the second hour, half hour here, we're going to spend some time really kind of talking about, the grief process, what you go through, and there are some very helpful things in here, not only in terms of their own experience, but then there's a whole section on principles for grieving, and some great resources that are part of the book. And so whether you get the book or not, I wanted you to hear some of that. If you are going through some kind of loss, pain, or grief right now, and that's probably a majority of our listeners in one way or another, or if you're going to, and that's the rest of us, it certainly seems to me that we can learn some very important lessons right now. And so that's why I wanted you to know more about this book, Losing Cooper. It is a book that is very well written and has about 180 pages. And we have the link to jjjasper.com so that you can get copies of it. And we also have a small review that was done, interestingly enough, by somebody that you know. So you can kind of see a little book review and all the rest. And then you might want to watch the video as well, Flame On, which when we come back from the break, we'll keep that and talk about why you called it Flame On. There's a very good reason for that. But if you'd like to join the conversation today, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. If you're going through a process or maybe have some questions about that, we certainly would encourage you to give us a call. If it's difficult for you to share all of the details, you can remain anonymous, but feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to know a little bit more about J.J. Jasper, or sending you to his website, but the simplest one is simply to go to pointofview.net. We have all the links there and all the information that you would like to know, and so we certainly encourage you to take the time to visit our website, pointofview.net, and find out more about the book. We've posted an article about it. We have some other video clips that you might want to watch, and what you can do is then hit that share button, maybe put it on your Facebook page, or send it to somebody that needs to see that, and you'll expose them to the wonderful hope in learning how to grieve well. J.J. Jasper with me in studio. We'll take some of your phone calls right after these important messages.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
In studio with me today, J.J. Jasper. For those of you that listen to American Family Radio, you know him as the co-host of the morning show, and he's with American Family Radio, American Family Association, but also the author of the book, Losing Cooper, Finding Hope to Grieve Well. Fantastic book, Great endorsements there, as well as the DVD, which we'll talk more about in just a minute. Flame On, a true story of hope in the midst of great personal tragedy. And JJ's with us. Let's take a phone call, and we'll get back into some of the material in the book. Let's head out to Florida first. Bud, thank you for joining us today. You're on with JJ Jasper.
Yes, thank you. JJ, a year ago, my 30-year-old son was tragically hit by a car and died. And I didn't expect to fall into this emotionally. I know the Lord, and my son knew the Lord. Sorry. Anyway, my question is, I was teaching an 8th grade Bible class in my Christian school, and the day I learned of his death, and the curriculum was on thankfulness. So I have faithfully thanked the Lord for teaching my son. And I went through a program in my local church called Grieve Well. And obviously, I'm not done grieving. So my question is, what's next?
Bud, thank you for calling, and I'm so sorry for your loss. You sound like we do, because we'll be going along having a pretty normal day, and then the word I use will be ambushed by grief. You'll hear a song, a fragrance, something will trigger, and out of nowhere you just get T-boned, and you're going to be able to spend more time with your son in eternity than you did here on earth. But you talked about you're doing the different things. You know that grief is not an event; it's a process, and there are stages, common stages that people go through. But how you respond in each stage, grief is as individual as a fingerprint. Some people go to the cemetery every single day; others can't bear the thought to go. So it is a process, and one thing we did is just go back to the basics. We would pray when we didn't want to. We would read the Bible when we didn't feel like it. But I've got an entire chapter called Grieving Well.
Yes.
And it talks about, necessary to find a qualified counselor and to be careful with pharmaceuticals and different steps that you can take. I wish we had more time, Bud, but I'm so sorry for your loss. If I could share this story with you, the pastor is also a friend that did the graveside service. After the funeral, we were there in the cemetery, just the immediate family, and he said, and this will be for you, Bud, he said in the next few days and weeks, people will come up with you with good intentions, and they'll say, in time, you'll get over this. Unfortunately, that's not true. You're never going to get over it. No. He said, you'll get through it with the Lord's help, but this is not a wound that will heal. This is an amputation. And just like someone's lost a hand or a foot or an arm or a leg, you're going to have to find a new normal. You're going to have to find a new way to do life, just like a person who no longer has an arm. So people with good intentions will say, in time you'll get over this. But, Bud, and our family knows, and so many that are hurting listening, you'll never get over it, but you will get through it with the Lord's help. And please don't give up, don't quit, don't stop, don't throw in the towel. Continue to go towards the Lord. This book is 19 chapters of hope, but hope has a name, and his name is Jesus. But he'll help you just like he did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He was with Daniel in the lion's den, Joseph in the pit, and he'll be there when you're weak. He'll be strong.
Can't wait to get the book.
Well, I would think that Losing Cooper, and also we mentioned Max Lucado's book, you'll get through this.
You'll get through this.
I've actually read Max Lucado's book, and it was a blessing to me.
Powerful book.
And one of those chapters is all about J.J. Jasper, who's with us today.
Amen. Thank you.
Well, Bud, thank you for sharing that.
Thank
I know
you,
it's
Bud.
tough always to be vulnerable, but it really makes the case. Let me take one more, and then we'll get back to your book, because I thought we'd head out to New Hampshire this time. WBCI. Joni, thank you for calling today.
Hey there, how are you, gentlemen?
Very good. Share us your story, because it's another one that we certainly need to hear.
Sure. Well, I did see the movie. I was in Texas, actually, doing a dog show, and I saw Flame On. What a great name and a great movie. And then Max Lucado's biography came on, so I got a double whammy of good, godly. Anyway, so I had a son who went to be with the Lord about 15 years ago. He was 7 years old.
Oh.
And it was a car accident, and I was driving, and my two girls and I were Two of us broke our necks. One was uninjured, and my son was killed in Wyoming. And you're right, it is an amputation. It's not, but we do get through it with the Lord's help. And I must say, he never wastes any pain that we have, and I think that is so encouraging. And he has made me and you and everyone every trial, really, he makes us into a special tool in his tool belt to pull out when no other tool will work. And I'm so glad that he uses the pain that my children and I faced with the loss of my son. But in another way, he isn't lost, and we do have a hope that others don't have. And as a parent, we have the fortunately rare and special gift of knowing, well, as much as you can know of someone's salvation, that to live knowing that our son is in heaven, our sons are in heaven, to know they're with Christ. What a special treasure to live with.
Joni, that's what he goes back to, that little baby born in a manger who lived a sinless life, who paid the penalty for our sin by dying on the cross, and after the third day he rose from the dead. So resurrection power is available. We don't grieve as those who have no hope. We do have a hope that we'll see our loved ones again if they had a personal relationship with the Lord. Joni, thank you so much for sharing your story, and I'm so sorry for your loss. And if I can share something that you'll certainly relate with, we had people warn us of the first. We knew the first birthday. We knew the first Thanksgiving, the first Christmas was going to be brutal, but no one warned us about the first trip to the restaurant, the first church service, the first trip to the store, and you've got that empty seat. There's a void, a seat missing at the table. That person's no longer on the other end of the phone. The conversations are gone. No more hugs or laughter. There's just a memory. So there's a lot of ways that you can reach out and help people. You know, the scripture says in 2 Corinthians 1, 3, and 4, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion, God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God. You're in a unique position, as you mentioned, Joni. You've earned the right to be heard. When people say, how are you able to still put one foot in front of the other? You can point to the cross. You can point to the empty tomb and tell them that Jesus is a life changer. Right. That is absolutely true. And in Facing the Giants, which I just happened to have rewatched recently, if this happens or doesn't happen, will I still love the Lord? And that's a big question, and I love him even more, because he's done more for me now than he had before my son had died. And I agree, those special kids, those ones, I've talked to a few people whose children have died, and there's something, it's like God pours a lifetime of blessing into those few little years we have with them. And not that our other children aren't amazing, but there's something that God gives us with those children he knows he's taking home.
Yes. Joni, I appreciate your phone call. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joni. For all your work.
Yes,
Thank
and
you.
let me encourage all of our listeners to pray for Bud and Joni. And of course, we're going to hear from some others in just a few minutes. But just before we take a break, the first trip to the restaurant or some subsequent trips to the restaurant, you talk about this in the book as well. You have all girls, so they look at you and say, oh, you got all girls. You trying for a boy? And how do you answer that? Well, we used to have a boy, but we don't now. At least on Earth. Yeah, you have to have a ready answer. We give some things to watch for, and we tried to offer some practical and biblical tips. We weren't ready for that. We had 3 girls and a boy, and then, as you mentioned, people would go, oh, all girls, and they say, you know, about the boy. And then if you don't say anything, you feel like you haven't honored his memory. If you do say something, it gets very awkward and people shy away. So there's a lot of dynamics there that I wasn't prepared for. But, you know, as difficult as it is to lose a loved one, and not just a loved one, Kirby, we're hearing from so many people that say, you know, I've lost a job or my marriage has failed, and you grieve when you go through a divorce, the same stages of grief. So if you have suffered loss,
just know that the Lord is able to be there for you, and he really is faithful. Those words about his grace is sufficient, they really are true.
They really are true. Great story. We'll continue our conversation with J.J. Jasper and his book, Losing Cooper, right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Maria Nolan in St. Anne Catholic School had a falling out. Nolan thinks her religious employer fired her from her job as principal of the school for speaking out against what she viewed as racial discrimination. The Diocese of Birmingham, Alabama, that operates St. Anne's, said that Nolan simply wasn't the right person to advance their religious mission. Nolan's responsibilities were pretty clear. As principal, she was responsible for implementing an educational atmosphere charged with the Catholic beliefs of her employer. That included monitoring lesson plans to make sure the teaching of the church was reflected in the lessons of the classroom, leading school prayers, and organizing religious activities for the students and the faculty. The court quickly determined that there was little doubt that Nolan's role as principal falls within the general ambit of the ministerial exception. Although she lacked the formal title of minister, her role clearly conveyed the church's message and carried out its mission. Therefore, the court could not interfere with what amounts to a decision by a religious body as to who best perpetuates its religious message and mission. The ministerial exception is an important doctrine that protects the unique aspects of a religious employer, giving relief to religious organizations from the rigors of employment law that may hamper their unique religious mission. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. J.J. Jasper in studio with us as we talk about, again, Losing Cooper. We also been talking about the DVD, and Joni mentioned a minute ago, Flame On. People might say, why did you call it Flame On? Well, anybody that's ever watched the Human Torch, which is part of the Fantastic Four, remember that he'll go flame on.
To activate his superpowers.
And that is what your son was saying even while you were driving around,
if
right?
If he was riding on my back, he would yell flame on for me to go faster, and he loved to laugh, and that was one of his favorite sayings. And you do a lot of reflecting after you lose a loved one. You remember what they were wearing, you remember the last conversation when they were standing on the porch and waved, and even the look on their face. And after a lot of contemplation, I remembered that was his last words on earth, flame on.
Flame on.
And so we just wanted to, fan the flame, flame on for the Lord Jesus Christ. You don't know if you have 5 years or 50 years, so you want to make every single day count. In fact, I think it was C.S. Lewis that said we need to be reminded more often than we need to be taught. And through this journey, Kirby, we've been reminded that life is precious, but it's also fragile. And we tell people, turn the TV off, get down on the floor and play with those children, play with those grandchildren. That old adage is true. You never know when it's going to be the last opportunity to say I love you to someone you care about.
And when Flame On was actually part of what you were doing, you were slowing the go-kart down, and you say Flame On, and then you'd speed it up and those kinds of things.
Exactly.
But that brings me to my next point. Chapter 12 in your book, perhaps one of the most powerful chapters, because Joni was driving her car when that accident took place. You were driving the go-kart when the accident took place.
Yes.
And grief and guilt just overwhelmed you. And speak to that, if you might.
You're exactly right. I've got a chapter in the book called Forgiveness. There's a chapter, Guilt and Regret.
Mm-hmm.
And, I wanted to try to back up and find something in the timeline where I could have an aha moment and say, there, right there. I thought if I'd never bought the dune buggy, this never would have happened. Mm-hmm. Then I would say, well, if we'd never bought the farm, it wouldn't have happened. You know what? If we hadn't gotten married and had children, we wouldn't be in this dark valley. We wouldn't be experiencing this pain. If my parents had never met and married, so you can't do that. You can drive yourself crazy trying to fix the timeline. You can't unring a bell. You can't change the past if it was 5 minutes ago or 50 years ago. But guilt and regret, it's horrible. And the old enemy, the accuser of the brethren, perch on your shoulder and say, this was your fault, you're to blame. And at one point, my daughter, I was having some pretty frequent meltdowns. 2 or 3 days into the journey, my teenage daughter crossed the room, grabbed me literally by the shoulders, shook me as hard as I've been shaken, and said, Dad, you loved Cooper. You would lay down your life. This was an accident. This was an accident. And she just said, look at me, look at my eyes. You're not going to be any use to us if you're paralyzed like
That's
this.
Right.
We need you. We need you to be strong. And so, I could say more, but I took a year and a half to write the book, and I tried to say it all in that chapter and subsequent chapters. And we just tried to offer a blueprint, a roadmap to help people, like the subtitle says, to be able to grieve well. So many people are not grieving well, and they've just gone, they're paralyzed by anger or bitterness or guilt. And so, that's just a terrible place to be. And we want you to be able to grieve in an appropriate way, in a healthy way, in a way that honors God. And so you can live a fruitful, healthy life and be a blessing to those around you.
Grieving Well is chapter 17, and again, just an outstanding chapter. Lots of very practical things. Even as I was reading through that, I thought, JJ, you're brilliant. I mean, you've thought of things that I've never thought of. And if I'm engaged in counseling others or going through it myself, a lot of great warnings, a lot of very practical material. So I just see why so many people are saying, let's get this book, not just to tell your story, but to help you if you're going through the grieving process right now, and what to avoid, some of the pitfalls, and what to do right so that you are grieving well.
A lot of people say, what do I say to someone who's lost a loved one? Less is more. In the receiving line at the visitation, probably 95% of the people came up and said, I don't know what to say. And then they would just give us a hug or a firm handshake, and that was enough. Just the fact that they were there. So you want to be careful. What you never want to say is, I know exactly how you feel, because you don't. You say, well, my aunt died, so I know exactly how you feel losing your husband of 40 years. No, everyone grieves differently. There's a lot of common stages, but grief is as individual as a fingerprint in terms of how a person navigates through those different stages. So, there's a lot of hurting people, not just people that have lost loved ones. We touched on this. If you've lost a job, if your home has been in foreclosure, if you're suffering from any kind of loss, there's hope available. God loves you. He has a plan for your life. He really is sovereign. Even though you've experienced tragedy, that doesn't take away from his nature. He's still holy. He's a good God. And it's okay to get angry, and it's okay to ask why. But he's the potter and we're the clay. His ways are higher than our ways. And God loves you, and he really does have a plan for your life. And if you're hurting right now, his plan is to come alongside and rescue you. In Psalm 34:18, it says he's close to the brokenhearted.
Yes. Well, I wish I could get to all these wonderful phone calls here today, because a lot of people have stories, but we're just about out of time, and I wanted to finish the story by talking about the fact that you now have twins, but that's a new challenge for you as well.
That is a new chapter. We prayed about having another child. After Cooper died, we knew we couldn't replace him, but the Lord gave us Casey James Jasper, and we were overjoyed. She's our little 4-year-old. She's still under warranty. Well, then at the end of the summer, we were surprised. No, we were shocked that my wife was expecting, and lo and behold, twins. When I shared this at our devotion at the ministry where I work, my boss said, I'm going to start calling you Jabraham. So we're not getting any younger. The Lord knows what he's doing, and we just had twins born. They're a month old, so we're not getting any sleep, but we're having a lot of fun.
But one has Downs, doesn't it?
The little boy, Bodie, he has Down syndrome. Sure does. But
there's a great video that people can watch about this as well.
Oh,
where you're in the crib.
Yeah. Thank you, Kirby. We, he came in a little different package than we anticipated, but we've got a little boy and a little girl. I joked with our listeners. Everyone wanted to know about their names. I said, well, we're going to name the babies Copy and Paste. But we, Tegan and Bodie, and got a little boy and a little girl, so I've been given a second chance, and God he's a redeemer. It's amazing. If you will not run from the Lord, if you'll run to him and just give him a chance, that's all he asks, that you give him a chance for him to love you, for his precious Holy Spirit to help you. He's the comforter. God can comfort you in a way that no human can if you're hurting today.
Well, again, that's why I wanted to get you here, and it is just a delight that you took the time to come and be in studio with us. But again, the book is entitled Losing Cooper, Finding Hope to Grieve Well. The DVD that we're talking about, Flame On, and we have links to jjjasper.com and some other material. So you just want to put this in the hands of individuals. If they want to contact you and maybe have you speak, you're a motivational speaker, you're a comedian, but you also have a story that I think would really resonate with people in various congregations, they can contact you through the website.
Yes, they can go to jjjasper.com, and we're seeing a pattern, people that are reaching out saying, someone gave me this book. So I don't think they have the strength. They're very raw and they're grieving. They don't have the strength to go get it themselves. But people are putting it in their church library. They're giving that as a gift and including a card. And so we're thankful that God is using this as a resource.
Well, I've counted you as a good friend, and I've learned a lot more from learning the story vicariously, now reading the book, seeing the DVD, and having you in studio. So it has been great to have you here. Let's do this again sometime. But thank you so very much for being so vulnerable and giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
We are grateful. This has been a real honor to be here, and we appreciate Point of View and appreciate you, Kirby. God bless you.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some other topics. But again, all of the information related to our conversation today is available on the website, pointofview.net. Don't forget, you can also download a podcast. I might encourage you to listen to that again or send it to someone else that needs to hear it. We'll be back right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information. about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. The first hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about leadership, especially leadership principles from the Bible. And whether you are a leader, you are probably leading someone, or someone is following you, and these are principles that certainly we can glean from some of the giants in the Bible. The book is written by John Maxwell, the #1 New York Times bestselling author, coach, and speaker, founder of the John Maxwell Company. He's oftentimes referred to as America's #1 leadership authority. He has more than 24 million books in 50 languages. He speaks to Fortune 500 companies, presidents of nations, but he's also going to speak with us today. John Maxwell, how are you doing?
Great, Kirby. How are you doing today, my friend?
I was just reflecting on the fact that decades ago, I think, my first interview with you, and you were just kind of getting started in all this, and look at how God has blessed all the things that you've written over the years on leadership.
Yes, although I wish you wouldn't say decades.
Well, you and I are a little bit older now.
Painful about that, my friend, but yeah, I remember that well. It's good to be with you again, too.
Well, let's talk about this. Learning from the giants, life and leadership lessons from the Bible. First of all, let me just mention, as you go to our website, we have information about John Maxwell. We have a link to his website. There's a place where you can find this book and many other books that I think you're going to find very helpful. But it's really a great opportunity here to learn from the Bible. And most of the time, John, when people teach on leadership, and I've done this, or when pastors address it, usually they talk about the book of Nehemiah, because there's lots of leadership principles. The good news is you take on some others that maybe people hadn't thought about: Elijah and Elijah, as well as Jacob and Deborah and Joshua, Daniel. So we can learn quite a bit from these great giants, in a sense they can mentor us today from the Bible.
We sure can. And what I try to do, Kirby, in this book is to take the life of these giants and put it in one sentence, kind of summarize it, break it down, make it simple, make it applicable. I read one time that, basically our legacy statement is going to be one statement or one sentence. And so, in fact, I challenge people all the time on their legacy. I say, choose it now. Don't wait till you die and then leave everybody guessing at the funeral, trying to figure out who was he and what did he do. And what's so great about these biblical giants is it's right there in front of us, their legacy and their statement to us. And so the book is about giants of the Bible, but basically summing their life up in one statement so that we can understand it, get our arms around it, and more importantly, we can practice it in our own life.
Let's talk about Elisha. Just 2 weeks ago, I was in Israel and on Mount Carmel, which is where this great battle took place between Elijah and Ahab. Your kind of one-sentence statement there: God loves you on your bad days, because basically he has, if you will, a good day, and that is he confronts the prophets of Baal as well as Ahab and Jezebel. But then he's convinced that, after all, nobody is following me and I'm all alone. The leadership principle there is an important one, because, as you well know, having spoken to leaders all over the world, sometimes leadership can be a very lonely occupation, and you sometimes wonder if you're the only person that is out there really trying to take it in the direction that you believe God has called you to take it in.
Kirby, that is so true. In fact, I tell leaders all the time, basically there are no two good consecutive days in a leader's life, just because you're dealing with people, you're dealing with problems,
That's
you're dealing
right.
with issues. And so here's this great man, Elijah, the greatest prophet, the #1 influencer in the country, and He has a great day on Mount Carmel, and then, of course, he gets discouraged over Jezebel. And next thing we know, the guy's run 100 miles, and he's wanting to die, and he's having a pity poor me party. And here's what I love about this. This is going to be, I think this is, I wish we had a lot of time to work this thought. But you see, I think Elijah became disappointed in himself. I think he basically did what we all do. He said, how could I be so great for God one day and so stinking bad the next day? And I think we all do that. I mean, I've had those days, Kirby, where I look and say, I was really good for God yesterday, and I'm not doing so hot today. And he became disappointed in himself. Now, here's the key. So what did he do? He hid. He ran. He wanted to get away from everything. He wanted to die. Okay, those are all results of being disappointed in yourself. Here's the point. I think when we're disappointed in our behavior, we reflect that and put that on God. And we assume that he's disappointed in us. And in this chapter, I basically got kind of bold, and I just basically said, we can't disappoint God. And I believe that because, you see, disappointment's the gap between expectation and reality. And we all get disappointed when what we expected isn't real. But in God's, he knows all about us. He knows my strengths. He knows my weakness. He knows the hairs on our head, Kirby. So he knows everything about us. So we can't surprise God. And when Elijah did this behavior, I don't think God looked at Elijah and said, oh, my gosh, I'm shocked. I don't know what to do with you. See, so what happens is I think when we disappoint God, when we are disappointed in ourselves, we assume that we disappoint God. And what does God do? God comes looking for him, calling his name. He says, hey, and what I love about it is when he finished interacting with Elijah, what did he tell him to do? Get right back in the ministry. Get off. We're supposed to leave footprints in the sands of time, and Elijah's out there leaving butt prints in the sands of time. He's sitting there, and he's feeling bad about himself. And God said, hey, get back out there. In fact, when he got right back out in ministry, one of the first things he did is found Elisha, who would be his successor. So I think there's a valid point for all of us in this book, and that is the fact that we disappoint ourselves. Of course we do. I do. But that doesn't mean God is disappointed in us. The classic example of that's the prodigal son.
Sure.
What did he say when he finally came to his senses? He said, okay, I'm going to go home to Dad's because I'm starving out here and I get 3 square meals at Dad's house. But I won't come back as a son. I'll come back as a servant. I'll ask for a bunkhouse out there in the barn somewhere with a bed. And he's got this thing all figured out that he's coming back as a servant. But God looked at him. He said, in fact, I love the passage where he said, I've disobeyed you. I'm no longer worthy to be called a servant. And I love that passage where it says, and God didn't listen to him. The father didn't listen to him. He wasn't listening to his son. He wasn't listening to all the disappointment in his life. He said, let's rejoice. My son's come back. And I think, again, so many times when we disappoint God, we put ourselves out in the barn somewhere and say, I'll be a servant. And God said, no, no, no. You're my child. You're my son. You're my daughter. Come on, let's get back in here. Let's rejoice in you and who I am through you. And so I love the Elijah chapter in this book because I just think many of the listeners today to your program, they just think, wow, I've disappointed God beyond repair. And you haven't. You haven't. And that's just encouraging to me because I'm human. And I think it's going to be encouraging to a lot of your listeners today also.
Outstanding book, and you just got a little bit of a sample of the wisdom. When we come back, we'll talk about a few others. Maybe since we mentioned Elisha, we'll mention that one. And for you women, certainly got to talk about Deborah and a few others. But this is one book that I would certainly recommend to you, along with Running with the Giants. So we're talking about learning from the giants, running with the giants. And, of course, we have a link to the Maxwell Company, and that John Maxwell Company is on our website, or you can go to it directly. We'll give you the URL in just a minute, and I would encourage you to get some of these books. But I also might say to those of you in leadership positions, perhaps you're a pastor, perhaps you're a Bible study teacher or a Bible fellowship leader, these would be great books to use in terms of teaching leadership to your congregation or to the people in your small group. So please take advantage of some of these resources. We'll continue our conversation with John Maxwell right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, one of the many dividing lines between progressives and conservatives is their belief in the efficiency and effectiveness of government bureaucracies. Liberals may have some misgivings about how they are treated at the Department of Motor Vehicles or by the TSA at airports. Nevertheless, they tend to believe that government is the solution to most social and political problems. Conservatives are usually more skeptical about government and support the private sector over the public sector, but their reactions seem tempered by the fact that they generally have high respect for people in the military and law enforcement. It's this difference in perspective concerning federal bureaucracies that shows up in many debates, including the current one about vetting refugees and other immigrants. In a recent column, Kevin Williamson asked, who seriously thinks that our public institutions are up to the job of properly investigating tens of thousands of refugees, asylum seekers, and ordinary immigrants every year? If Donald Trump's temporary order seems to you unreasonable, ask yourself what the next best option is and how much confidence we should have in it. When I read or hear someone assure us that the government screening of refugees and immigrants is very effective, I want to ask them some questions. Have you been to the DMV or the VA recently? Have you visited an immigration office recently? Sometimes you find a well-run organization, but far too often you probably walked out of a government building shaking your head because it was hardly run efficiently and effectively. Add to this the reality that the information from some of these countries for these refugees and immigrants is sketchy at best. That is why I think some are more trusting of the federal bureaucracy than is warranted. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We are privileged to have with us for just a little bit longer John C. Maxwell talking about his book, Learning from the Giants, Life and Leadership Lessons from the Bible. Look for it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link to the John C. Maxwell Company, and you can get those books there as well. You mentioned Elisha just a minute ago, your summary, give your best wherever God puts you. And it sort of reminds me of Luke 16, where it says, if you're faithful in little things, you'll be faithful in large things. And certainly this is a very important principle because, in a sense, what God is saying is we should bloom wherever we're planted. And if indeed we're faithful in those smaller areas, God will give us a greater harvest and a greater opportunity for ministry.
Right on, Kirby. Right on, my friend. You see, Elisha is a beautiful example of a person who, for years, many years, was number two.
Yeah.
And Elijah, of course, was the great prophet. Came back after his discouraging time and did some amazing things. And Elisha was described in the Bible as the person who poured water on the hands of Elijah, which is nothing more than a menial servant kind of a role. And what's interesting is Elijah found him at the farm. And Elisha's family were pretty well-to-do farmers. So this is a man who had a fairly prominent position in an agriculture type of a society, and yet he followed and was faithful and just, poured water on the hands, did anything that Elijah needed, and just waited his time. And when everybody looked at him, they didn't look at him long because Elijah was the main object. And, of course, in this chapter, I talk about the fact that, as you just mentioned, be faithful in the small things. And, there came the day when, if you see me go, you get a double portion of my spirit. And I love how Elisha fought for that. Elijah said, wait here, I'm going to go over. No, I'm going to stay with you. I'm going to stay with you. I'm going to stay with you. I'm going to serve you. I'm going to serve you. I'm going to serve you. And he watched him go, and he received that double portion. And biblically, it's recorded that Elisha did twice as many miracles, literally, as Elijah. And he had that double portion, but it didn't come fast, and it didn't come early, and it didn't come suddenly, and it didn't come, dramatically. It just came to him as he watched Elijah, and it's a great example of us just being faithful today, and we get rewarded tomorrow. God's payday isn't always on Friday, Kirby.
Again, here's a man that works in obscurity in some ways, and up until fairly recently, I could honestly say that I spent more years as a staff member or a vice president than I did as a president, more years as a guest host than I did as a host, so I recognize that there are a lot of listeners out there that are saying, I'm really just doing just a menial task. I'm just a part of a bigger organization. I'm just one staff member in a ministry or church or whatever it might be. But God looks at our faithfulness wherever God has placed us, and our faithfulness in those small things oftentimes leads to a ministry that involve larger things.
That's so true, and aren't we glad that we're part of that?
Let's, if we can, since we mentioned, I wanted to at least have one for the women. Deborah, when people are thinking of leaders, they're going to think of Joshua. They're going to think of maybe Joseph. They're certainly going to think of Nehemiah. But I am so glad that you have a chapter there about Deborah. God specializes in the unexpected, and oftentimes leadership is placed upon individuals that did not really see that would be coming to them.
Oh, that's so true, and this is very true in Deborah's life. She was a judge, of course, after Joshua passed away. The children of Israel had judges for a period of time, and she's a woman. Okay, and she was not only a woman, but she was a very, very effective leader, and then God spoke to her. She was also not only a judge, but she was a prophetess, and he began to share with her how that he was going to give Israel, after 20 years basically of captivity, a tremendous victory in battle, and she declared it, and she stood out. And I heard Warren Wiersbe one time say that if you can explain what God is doing in your ministry, then God's not doing a great work in your ministry.
Good line.
I love that.
I do.
I love it. And I think Deborah was one of those people. She couldn't explain it, and no one else could understand it. They just watched how God honored her, and she was willing to stand out when others, just didn't expect someone to do that. She spoke out when no one else was speaking out. She stepped out when no one else was stepping out. I mean, this was a lady that was a phenomenal leader, and she's a perfect example. Paul talked to the church of Corinth about how he uses the simple things. God uses the base things, the foolish things to confound the wise. She's a beautiful example of the fact that God just really, the greatest ability in God's sight that we have as a leader is availability. And she was available, and God used her beautifully and gave the children of Israel that great victory. I'm glad to have her in the book because it just shows that God uses all kinds of people in different situations for his glory.
Just one more before I let you go, and that is Joshua. That would be one that I think most people might think of in terms of leadership principles. And when you deal with Joshua or Nehemiah, you could write whole books on it, but I love, again, the fact that you summarize his life by saying that God is greater than your greatest challenges. And certainly Joshua faced incredible challenges, especially trying to keep the children of Israel together to go against a military foe that many of them were fearful of.
Well, when you think about it, he did what Moses didn't do. He took the children of Israel into the promised land. And the challenge that he had was the fact he followed such a great leader, and it was his mentor. But yes. I've always said the reason that God buried Moses and no one could find him is because the children of Israel would have gone and found him and dug him up and basically had his corpse hanging around him as long as they possibly could. And they needed to go forward, not backward. And Josh was just powerful in the fact that when he went to the Jordan, this is beautiful. He didn't have a rod, and I can't. You hear the people that heard the old story say, "Man, where's his rod?" Moses raised his hands, and the water parted. And it shows us again that God uses different people as different ways for tremendous things. And Joshua never felt into bondage of having to be, quote, like Moses, because what he was called upon was to do something that Moses wasn't even able to do. And it's a beautiful story, I think, of the fact that God is faithful from one generation to another generation, and his will come to pass. And it may not be the greatest leader in the Old Testament, Moses, bringing it to pass, but it's someone like Joshua who's willing to absolutely rise up above his circumstances and really let God use him.
Wow. Just before I let you go, one of the things that we have done is have a link to johnmaxwell.com. And when people land on your website, they can find out about your events, various resources, follow your blog. But talk for just a minute, if you would, John, about some of the things that I think many of our listeners would benefit from by landing on your website.
Well, I'm so excited. I have a nonprofit organization called Equip that this coming June we will have finished our task of training leaders in every nation of the world. We've trained 6 million leaders in 194 countries. We have 6 countries yet to go. And if they go to our website, they're going to find out about that. If they go to our website, they're going to find out about an amazing 4,500, 4,800 coaches in over 100 countries in the world now that I've trained and certified so that they can coach and teach and speak and help lead others. We're just really thrilled. And Kirby, thanks for just giving me a moment, because God's doing some wonderful things for our organizations, and we're very grateful. And again, we just feel like Warren Wiersbe. We can't explain it, so God must be doing it.
Let me also mention one other book, 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. I think you've got a 10th anniversary edition. That is a book I have taught from, as well as many of your others, and I thank you for the great work that you've done. So please, if you would, go to the website, johnmaxwell.com. You'll find lots of great resources. You probably will find most of these books that we're talking about in the bookstore, but if not, there is a way for you to link up with John Maxwell. And if you'd like to learn more about training or to begin to see the whole vision and their philosophy, you can find that on the website. So, John Maxwell, always great to have you on the program. Let's do it again sometime.
Oh, Kirby, thanks for having us. And also, my Maxwell Leadership Bible just came out in the NIV version, too.
I might mention that as well.
Hey, thanks, buddy.
Thank you.
Blessings on you and your listeners. Thanks for having me. Great to be with you as always.
All right. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I'm going to continue this theme, and we're going to look at some other principles that I think we can discern from Scripture. And so I'm going to be doing a little bit of a teaching time, but already we've probably put a few questions on the table that you might have. So if you'd like to join our conversation, this next half hour is kind of an open line as we look at leadership principles that we find in the Bible. We've already had a chance to hear a little bit from John Maxwell. When we come back, I'm going to mention some other books that have been very significant to me in terms of leadership. And as I mentioned before, all of us are leaders in one way. You're a leader in your home. You're a leader in your church. Maybe even in your neighborhood, people sort of pay attention to you. So it isn't just for the CEOs, the captains of industry. All of us can learn some of these leadership principles from Scripture. And so if you have something to write with, when I come back, I'm going to give you 10 characteristics of leadership that we see in the Bible, and then even maybe give you some contemporary examples of individuals, not all of them are Christian, that maybe demonstrate some of that in their business or their ministry. Let's take a break, but visit our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back with more right after this.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
And continue our conversation about some of these leadership principles that we can find in the Bible. First half hour, we spent some time talking with John Maxwell about his book, Learning from the Giants. And he focuses on really 9. We've looked at 4. Elijah, Elisha, Job, Jacob, Deborah, Isaiah, Jonah, Joshua, and Daniel. And I thought it was kind of interesting that he focused on some of those that we might not necessarily pick. For any of us that have ever taught through the book of Nehemiah, you know how many leadership principles are there. And as I mentioned, of course, with Joshua, there's quite a few. And of course, Joseph would be another example of leadership principles. So he picks 9 that I think would be very helpful to supplement maybe some that you've had in the past. But what I thought I would do is keep the theme going for a few more minutes, and that is to borrow from a book that I have used in the past to teach leadership, and that is a book called Leadership Secrets from the Bible. Lauren Wolf is the author. And if you think about it, the Bible does give us quite a number of examples of leadership principles that we can apply. And since we're kind of in the theme of learning from some of these mentors and leaders in the Old and New Testament, let's see if we can apply some of those. Now, if you have something to write with, I would encourage you to number from 1 to 10. If you don't have a chance to write right now, I know Shamila is going to try to put some of this on our Facebook page. You might want to visit it later. But I'm going to look at 10 characteristics of leadership and then give you some verses that relate to it, and then an example maybe from our contemporary culture. Now, though I'm pulling biblical principles out, some of the examples I use aren't necessarily going to be Christian leaders. They are when we can, but let's recognize that leadership principles are part of what we call common grace, and some people exercise various aspects of leadership even if they did not read the Bible or derive them from that. So are you ready? This is 1 through 10, and we'll see if we can get through this in the next half hour. And the first principle is honesty and integrity. A good leader needs to have honesty and integrity. And if you're taking some notes, you might put down, Proverbs 24, verse 26. Proverbs 24, verse 26, an honest answer is like a kiss on the lips. So says the writer of Proverbs in that particular case. Or you have this very famous passage in which David asked God to judge him. And in Psalm 7, verse 8, David says, "Judge me, O Lord, according to my integrity." So certainly honesty and integrity are part of that. And in the book of Leadership Secrets from the Bible, interestingly enough, Lauren Wolf quotes from another book by James Kuntz and Barry Posner, in which they actually surveyed people and found that honesty was one of the most frequently cited traits of a good leader. And later they even wrote a book on the subject of credibility. The book was entitled Leadership Challenge. If you're looking for additional books on leadership, that is certainly one of those. And of course, you can think about all sorts of examples in the Bible of people who kept their word no matter the consequences. Noah certainly fits into that category. Lot, Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah. If you think about many of the prophets, I mean, they paid a heavy price in the Old Testament for keeping their word, for being men, or in some cases, we just talked about a minute ago, women of integrity. You can think of it another way. Look at the 10 Commandments. At least 4 of the 10 Commandments deal with the issue of integrity and honesty. We have a commandment against what? Stealing. We have a commandment against murder. We have a commandment against false testimony. We have a commandment against covetousness. So at least you would say 4 of the 10 Commandments deal with this. So again, we can see how important honesty and integrity are for leadership. We can also look at the contrast to that, and we sort of see that when we talk about Elijah, because we see dishonesty with Ahab and Jezebel. Remember how they wanted to get the vineyard of Naboth,
And so they got two scoundrels, if you will, to testify that Naboth cursed God and the king, and so they basically succeeded in getting him stoned to death, and as a result, Ahab took control of the vineyard. So that's certainly one example. Probably a more positive example that we can think of in the Old Testament is David, who wanted to build an altar to the Lord in what today we call the city of David, and he built it on the threshing floor of the Jebusite, and actually the individual offered the floor for free, but David insisted on paying full price, even though he could have basically used, if you will, eminent domain of that time, or used executive fiat to actually have access to that. So there are lots of examples of integrity, and in the book, Leadership Secrets of the Bible, one of the examples that is used is Charles Wang. Those of us that are in the computer area remember the Wang computers, and Charles Wang of Computer Associates said, to be a successful person, you have to have integrity. Your word has to be everything you've got. You must have a moral compass. That's especially true if you're a leader, because you're exposed more. So you can see how morality and ethics and honesty are very important. Another example that they use in the book is Cadbury. You know, all of us love the Cadbury chocolates. Well, Sir Adrian Cadbury one time said, the ethical standards of a company are judged by its actions, not by pious statements of intent put out in its name. So, if nothing else, there are lots of contemporary examples of individuals in positions of leadership who say that honesty and integrity are two important characteristics. That's the first one. Well, what's the second one? The second one would be the idea of purpose. Good leaders are able to cast vision. They have a purpose. They have a direction. They know where he or she will be taking that business, that family, that church, that Christian ministry. And again, some very important verses that you might want to put under number 2 for purpose would be maybe 2 Corinthians 4, verse 16. Therefore, we do not lose heart. And here the Apostle Paul talks about why he does not lose heart at a time when he was really coming to the end of his ministry. And he begins to explain in 2 Corinthians 4 and continuing on to the first few verses in 2 Corinthians 5 why he does not lose heart. Another example is, of course, the Apostle Paul. He says in Acts 20, something our pastor just preached on yesterday, I may finish the race and complete the task. So purpose along with perseverance are very important. And I think we recognize that all of us need some kind of purpose, because work without some kind of purpose, without some kind of direction, sometimes can be kind of almost a mindless, heartless drudgery. And you can think of, for example, how just a minute ago we were talking about Moses. Really, the purpose of Moses was to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt into the promised land, and he had to work very hard to keep them on purpose. We just talked a minute ago about how Joshua had to keep them on purpose in the face of some possible fear and things of that nature. You can think of David in the Old Testament, was able to consolidate the power of Israel and strengthen it. And, of course, he was a great builder. And then, of course, Solomon came behind him and actually with his purpose was able to build the temple in 7 years, which is still an incredible feat. And so you can think of all sorts of ways in which purpose is very important. Max Dupree was the head of Herman Miller Furniture. He said, my goal is that when people look at us, not as a corporation, but as a group of people working intimately within a covenantal relationship, they'll say these folks are a gift to the Spirit. And so, again, the importance of purpose. William Pollard, who's been on this program with us before, was the chairman of Service Master, said we need a radical transformation in how business firms are led and also how future business leaders are taught. Executives who ignore their responsibility to lead and develop the business firm as a moral community do so at their peril. So some very important principles. Let me put one more on the table before we take a break, and that is number 3, kindness and compassion. Put down Job 29. Did I not cry for those in trouble? Daniel 4, O king, be kind to the oppressed. And it seems to me that certainly kindness and compassion need to be characteristics of any leader. We know, of course, Jesus taught the golden rule. Paul taught that we should clothe ourselves with compassion and kindness. And, of course, Ephesians 4, he says that we should be kind to one another. So certainly those are important principles there as well. One example of this is Herb Kelleher, who used to be the head of Southwest Airlines, said, "I know it sounds simple, but I keep saying follow the golden rule of service. Serve others as you would like to be served." And so, again, this was a attempt to recognize how important service, compassion, kindness are part of leadership. Let's take a break. We've only moved through 3 of those. We'll try to see if we can get through the rest after our break. But some very important principles that we can find in terms of biblical ideas. This comes from the book Leadership Secrets from the Bible. And earlier in the first half hour, we talked with John C. Maxwell, Learning from the Giants. If you'd like to know more about John Maxwell, visit our website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to see this list of these 10 principles, we'll post that on our Facebook page, and you're free to use those and maybe apply those in your teaching. But we need to take one of those mandatory breaks. When we come back, we'll talk about a few more leadership principles that we find in the Bible. All that coming up right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Maria Nolan and St. Anne Catholic School had a falling out. Nolan thinks her religious employer fired her from her job as principal of the school for speaking out against what she viewed as racial discrimination. The Diocese of Birmingham, Alabama, that operates St. Anne's, said that Nolan simply wasn't the right person to advance their religious mission. Nolan's responsibilities were pretty clear. As principal, she was responsible for implementing an educational atmosphere charged with the Catholic beliefs of her employer. That included monitoring lesson plans to make sure the teaching of the church was reflected in the lessons of the classroom, leading school prayers, and organizing religious activities for the students and the faculty. The court quickly determined that there was little doubt that Nolan's role as principal falls within the general ambit of the ministerial exception. Although she lacked the formal title of minister, her role clearly conveyed the church's message and carried out its mission. Therefore, the court could not interfere with what amounts to a decision by a religious body as to who best perpetuates its religious message and mission. The ministerial exception is an important doctrine that protects the unique aspects of a religious employer, giving relief to religious organizations from the rigors of employment law that may hamper their unique religious mission. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk about some of these leadership principles from the Bible. First half hour, of course, we talked with John C. Maxwell, talking about his book, Learning from the Giants. Now I've been taking some other leadership principles from a book called Leadership Secrets from the Bible, and we've already looked at honesty and integrity. Number 2, purpose. Number 3, kindness and compassion. Number 4, humility. We need humble leaders, and certainly we can see some good examples of that. If you're taking some notes, you might put down Proverbs 25, verse 17.
here, nor is it honorable to seek one's own honor. Or, of course, in Proverbs, also Proverbs 18, humility precedes honor. And you think about this, certainly Moses was a humble man. He falls down on his face, protests that he's not worthy to lead. Even David at one point said, I'm a little known and a poor child. Solomon said, I'm only a little child. I mean, in some respects, humility has been certainly a characteristic of a lot of individuals in leadership. And sometimes, if nothing else, the leadership responsibilities will humble you. Well, a good example of that is Ragil Martin that they use in the book. He was head of Merck, which is a pharmaceutical company. He said, if I were to put someone on the front cover of Business Week or Fortune, it would be the person who heads up our research organization, not me. Or I'd put a team of people on the cover. You know, at a time when we have CEOs with big egos, it's kind of refreshing here to see that kind of mindset. But certainly we have seen that to be the case. William Pollard, who's been on the program with us before, I mentioned his name just a minute ago, was Service Master, said, too often leaders sit in large offices and think they know and understand the people they lead. But his argument is, in his book on servant leadership, is servant leaders listen and learn from those that they lead. So again, 4 principles, and humility is the 4th one. The 5th one is communication. Very important. A leader needs to be able to communicate his or her vision, needs to be able to communicate to those that are part of that management team. Again, you can put down lots of verses from the Proverbs. Proverbs 18, verse 13, does not the ear test words as the tongue tests food? A verse that probably not very many of us have memorized, but certainly talks about the importance of being a good communicator and listener. Also, Proverbs 26, violence is sending the message of a fool. And you think of all the communication in the Bible, you know, whether it's the 10 Commandments and whether it's David speaking, whether, of course, it's the Sermon on the Mount by Jesus, communication, very, very important. And certainly good leaders are usually good communicators, are able to take the very essence of their vision and communicate it in a way that becomes transferable to others. One of the examples that is used in that book on leadership secrets in the Bible comes from, of all things, Land's End. If you're familiar with that mail order company, they have a principle where top executives of the company meet regularly with lower-level employees, the packers, the salespeople, the service people, for a working lunch, because they are close to the action and they come up with some of the best ideas for improving the operation. And if you've ever seen Undercover Boss, there's a great example of sometimes you see the disconnect between those in the corporate office and those who are actually out there doing the work. And that's, I think, always very interesting to see how there is sort of this epiphany that some of these CEOs have when they realize that the job that they're asking some of their employees to do is a little bit harder than they thought it might be. Anyway, those are the first 5. Let me move on so we can finish. Number 6 would be management. A good leader is able to manage himself and herself, but also the team. Proverbs 12 talks about he who heeds discipline shows life. And also, of course, we also quoted a minute ago from Acts 20, where Paul is talking about preaching anything that might be helpful. And we are certainly encouraged in Scripture to encourage one another. Hebrews 3 talks about the idea of encouraging one another daily. And then also Paul talks about in Acts 20, which we talked about just a minute ago, I have not hesitated to preach anything that would be helpful to you. 1 Thessalonians 5 is a whole section on the need for us to encourage one another. And certainly one of the best examples of that would be Mary Kay Ash. For all you Mary Kay directors out there and consultants, you might remember that Mary Kay encouraged her employees when she was alive with an idea of celebration. She signed hundreds of birthday cards offering free lunch and a free movie, and her motto was, appreciation is the oil that runs things. And so, again, we can see some great examples of how encouragement and management are very important. Number 7 would be team development. That is the idea that we're all part of one body. The Scriptures talk about that in 1 Corinthians 12, and even in Proverbs 27, iron sharpens iron just as one man sharpens another. And certainly the idea of developing a team, we see that probably very well in Nehemiah, where he assembled teams of Hebrews to reconstruct the wall, help them to understand that. Romans 12 talks about different gifts and different people, and so certainly team building is very important. Number 8 would be courage.
Certainly we see that with Joshua 1:9, be strong and courageous, and we can think of Queen Esther, we can think of Daniel in the lion's den, we can see David the shepherd boy confronting Goliath, and on and on and on. So certainly courage is very important. But since I use Mary Kay, let me remind everybody that when Mary Kay Ash told her attorney what she was going to do, he said, if you're going to throw away your life savings, why don't you just put it directly here in the trash can? Her accountant basically had the same message, and so here she's stepping out on faith, and then, as you may remember, her husband had a heart attack and died. Could have been a time for her to simply give up, but she had the courage to press on. Two last ones, justice and fairness for number 9, the importance of justice, and certainly Amos 5:24, let justice roll down like water. And, of course, in Micah 6:8, it talks about to act justly, to love mercy. Certainly we see very important principles in the Old and New Testament about justice, and certainly that is the case. And one of the examples that is used in the book comes from the founder of Curves for Women, in which he chose a flat fee rather than a percentage of revenues for the franchises because he said, quote, I wanted to do the right thing. And number 10, leadership development. Good leaders recognize that they won't always be around. They also need to train the future leaders, and we can see that certainly the case. In Deuteronomy 3, we see that they say, commission Joshua and strengthen him. And so we see how we go from Moses to Joshua. We can certainly see how David developed a leadership circle of men that followed him. We just talked a little bit about Elijah and Elisha, who then asked for a double portion. And so we can see how important those issues of leadership are certainly the case. And a good example of that might be Norman Brinker, best known for the Chili's franchise and all the rest. But in 1993, when he suffered a near-fatal polo accident, an individual took over, and now today his protégés run Chili's, TGI Fridays, Outback Steakhouse, and much, much more. And so you can see we've had some very good examples of orderly succession in the Bible, from Moses to Joshua, from David to Solomon. We also see some very disorderly succession as well, maybe David to Absalom. So you've got some great leadership principles in the Bible, and I would encourage those of you in positions of leadership to take some of those biblical principles and apply them not only in your life, but to teach them to others. If there's a need that we have today, it is for good, solid, credible leaders in the body of Christ, and anything we can do to develop leaders, I am all for that. So that's why we had John Maxwell with us the first half hour. That's why I wanted to share some of this in the second half hour. But when we come back from the break, we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. But if you'd like to know a little bit more about some of the things we've talked about today, visit our website, pointofview.net. You will find all sorts of videos and articles and other resources that are available to you. Please take the time not only to read them, but in many cases share them with others in your sphere of influence. When we come back, we'll focus on some very important issues in the news, but visit our website today, pointofview.net. And when you go there, don't forget that we are a listener-supported program, and anything you can do to help us financially would be greatly appreciated. Pointofview.net is your place to go. Make sure you bookmark it. Make sure you visit it often. We'll come back with more right after this.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
This hour we have an opportunity to talk with Rod Dreher about his new book, The Benedict Option. Actually, it's been around for quite some time, and those of us, especially in the Dallas area, remember when he was an editorial writer for the Dallas Morning News. And, of course, those of us remember his essay that was in the National Review about granola conservatism, which led to the book Crunchy Cons, How Birkenstocked Burkians, Gun-Loving Organic Gardeners, Evangelical Free-Range Farmers, Hip Homeschooling Mamas, Right-Wing Nature Lovers, and their diverse tribe of counterculture conservatives plan to save America. There's a shorter term, but that is a good one. And, of course, then The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming, and a book that I know was very instrumental in his life as well, and one that he talks about how Dante can save your life. He lives now in Louisiana, where he grew up, and joins us now by phone. Rod, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's great to be here.
And appreciate the writing that you've done over the years. And preceding you, we've sort of done a very good job of setting this up, because we've talked about what has happened at Middlebury College with Charles Murray, as well as with the professor there. The progressive professor was put in the hospital. Talked about some of the conflicts on campus. We even ended by quoting from John Smirek about what parents can do for their kids, which relates very much to some of the things you talk about in terms of classical Christianity and homeschooling and the rest. But just again, maybe to set the scene for people that have just tuned in, what are some pretty good evidences that we can see that we do live in a post-Christian school, post-Christian college, post-Christian society, and why we need to really consider an alternative?
Well, Kirby, I think that when some people think that they hear me say we live in a post-Christian society, they look around and say, that can't be true. There are churches everywhere. Everybody I know goes to church. My point is not that there are no Christians anywhere to be found. That's clearly absurd. My point is that the Christian faith, certainly as it has been received through history and as we have it presented to us in the Bible, is no longer at the center of American life. That is to say, we don't think about Christianity and think of it as the source of truth, of determinative truth for our culture. And instead, we have moved to something different. And it's very unsettled what's going to happen in the future because of that. And when I look at the church, because I'm really more concerned about the future of the church and the Christian faith than I am with the future of America, I see two very worrying trends that come to us from social science research. This is not just a conservative Christian like me sitting here and furrowing his brow. This is in research. We have, first of all, the sign that the millennial generation is falling away from Christian belief to a level and to a degree that we have never seen in American history. It's gone so far that even these two prominent social scientists who study religion, Voas and Chavez, say that America used to always be the exception to the secularism in Europe. You know, Europe, we all know the faith is flat on its back in Europe, but we thought America was an exception to that. But now with the millennial generation over the past 10 years, it's undeniable that America is declining on the same glide path to destruction in terms of the faith that Europe was. Secondly, it's the content of the faith, Kirby, that is really disturbing. Christian Smith, who is one of the leading sociologists of religion, he works out of Notre Dame, he and his colleagues have demonstrated over the years that the Christian faith that people who actually profess the faith believe is so far from biblical Christianity as to be almost a pseudo-religion. They've replaced the religion of the Bible with the religion of self-help, with the religion of comfort. They've replaced the cross with an electric blanket. And this has tremendous consequences because this cannot be called real Christianity. But this is what most American Christians believe. My contention in the Benedict Option is that we Christians have got to wake up to reality and realize the seriousness of the situation that we're in and take action right now in our own churches and our own Christian schools to protect the church from decline.
You know, and one of the things you do quote early on, you mentioned Christian Smith, and we've quoted him before. As a matter of fact, every Wednesday, Rod, we have a millennial roundtable. We'll have one again tomorrow. And we talk about some of those things like the research that they found that a lot of young people hold to what is called moralistic therapeutic deism. You know, they believe in God, but he's really kind of removed therapeutic, of course, what you're just talking about, kind of self-help and deism. And so we sometimes lament what is happening, and that's documented not only by Christian Smith, but these most recent surveys done by George Barna. When you look at both belief and behavior, and you put those two together, when you look for those people that would be integrated disciples, which is what we would call a person who is a practicing Christian, it's still a very, very small minority. So that's one of the reasons why you've looked back in history and looked at Saint Benedict to say, do we have an option about what to do? Because with the fall of the Roman Empire and with the decadence of Rome and what happened during the Middle Ages and even to our modern day, are there times in which we just have to preserve the faith? So explain a little bit more about what that Benedict option might look like.
Sure. Well, when St. Benedict of Nursia was a Christian man, a layman, he was not ordained, of the 6th century, who was sent down from his home in the Italian mountain village of Nursia to the city of Rome after the empire had fallen to finish his education. He was a pious Christian, and he got to the city and saw nothing but decadence and chaos and left. He said, I can't live here anymore. And he went out to the woods to pray and seek the Lord's will. He prayed and fasted. And after 3 years, he felt a calling to come out and start a religious order, which is to say a group of men who came together as monks to vow chastity and to live together and to train in the spiritual life. He wrote something called The Rule of St. Benedict, which is a simple little book about how to run a community, a religious community. And what he did, without knowing what he was doing, all he wanted to do was to figure out how can we serve the Lord fully with all our heart, soul, and mind in these very difficult times of chaos after the fall of the empire. What he ended up doing was spreading the gospel throughout Western Europe, barbarian Europe. He evangelized, he and his men who followed him evangelized, and they preserved the Christian faith within their monasteries by copying Scripture, copying the works of the Church Fathers and other things, and laid the groundwork centuries later for the rebirth of civilization. What does that have to do with us? There have been some very prominent people, among them Pope Benedict XVI and the philosopher Alistair McIntyre, one of the top philosophers in the world, who have compared the times we're living in now to the fall of Rome in terms of the moral chaos and the moral degeneration that we're living through. And I think that we, whether we're Catholic or Protestant or Eastern Orthodox, as I am, we can look back to this saint from the early centuries of Christianity and the way of life he prescribed for his monks and figure out what does he have to say to us lay people who are living in the world, not in a monastery, but in the world. What does he have to say to us about how we can strengthen our commitment to Christ and to each other in community in chaotic times?
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we will continue our conversation. We do have information about this book. You can go to the benedictoptionbook.com. Of course, we have a link on our website. Rod Dreher is with us as we talk about strategy for Christians in a post-Christian nation. We'll talk a little bit more about how that relates to things like order and work and some of the other aspects, and what a church for all seasons might look like, what a Christian village might look like, and what we should be thinking about in terms of education. Lots of things to cover. We'll do that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, one of the many dividing lines between progressives and conservatives is their belief in the efficiency and effectiveness of government bureaucracies. Liberals may have some misgivings about how they are treated at the Department of Motor Vehicles or by the TSA at airports. Nevertheless, they tend to believe that government is the solution to most social and political problems. Conservatives are usually more skeptical about government and support the private sector over the public sector. But their reactions seem tempered by the fact that they generally have high respect for people in the military and law enforcement. It's this difference in perspective concerning federal bureaucracies that shows up in many debates, including the current one about vetting refugees and other immigrants. In a recent column, Kevin Williamson asked, who seriously thinks that our public institutions are up to the job of properly investigating tens of thousands of refugees, asylum seekers, and ordinary immigrants every year? If Donald Trump's temporary order seems to you unreasonable, ask yourself what the next best option is and how much confidence we should have in it. When I read or hear someone assure us that the government screening of refugees and immigrants is very effective, I want to ask them some questions. Have you been to the DMV or the VA recently? Have you visited an immigration office recently? Sometimes you find a well-run organization, but far too often you probably walked out of a government building shaking your head because it was hardly run efficiently and effectively. Add to this the reality that the information from some of these countries for these refugees and immigrants is sketchy at best. That is why I think some are more trusting of the federal bureaucracy than is warranted. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Rod Dreher as we talk about his book, The Benedict Option, a strategy for Christians in a post-Christian nation. You probably can find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link so that you can order it as well if you'd like to get a copy. And you mentioned this idea of a rule for living. Let's talk about some of that because it relates to things like order and prayer and work and stability. Give us a little bit of an idea of what that looked like then, and then we can begin to talk about what it might look like in the 21st century.
Well, what's interesting about it, Kirby, is what it looked like then for 1,500 years ago for the Benedictines is what it looks like today for them within their monasteries. And what they've done, and again, I hasten to say that this is only for monks and nuns. This is not for ordinary people. But what you see when you go there is they have a very regimented way of life but it's very balanced. They have a certain amount of times in the day when they're supposed to pray, sing the Psalms, say their prayers, go to the Catholic Mass, and they have a certain time of the day that's set aside for Scripture study, a certain time for work, and so on and so forth. And the goal of it, according to St. Benedict, to his rule, is to make the monastery a, quote, a school for the service of the Lord. The idea is to grow in what Benedict called conversion of life. The idea is that after you've accepted Christ and been baptized into new life, you still have the whole life ahead of you. And, you know, the adventure of life as a Christian is one of constant repentance and growing more deeply in the Lord. Well, what we people today, what we people outside the monastery can learn is what it's like to order your own life around serving Christ and to make everything in your life come into the lordship of Christ. They do it in very practical ways. I mean, you look at the rule of St. Benedict, and I remember when I went to it, first time I thought, oh, this is going to be a book of ancient Christian mystical knowledge. It's not that at all. It's very ordinary meat and potatoes. This is how you live if you want to conform your life to Christ. And what I found from visiting with the monks there in St. Benedict's hometown today and reading the rule is that if we do things, if we make everything in our life sacred and make everything a gift to the Lord, and we do it in a disciplined way for the sake of forming our hearts and discipleship, then we will see great fruits come out of our lives, great fruits of the Spirit, fruits of love. We will see our families return to a loving order, and we will see our churches and communities blossom. But the sense of it, the heart of it is order, and not in the sense of you have to follow these strict rules or you're out the door, but rather a sense that there is a transcendent, invisible order that the Lord calls us to, and that we have to subject everything in our lives, every aspect of our lives, to Him in that way. And that means telling ourselves no on some occasions so we can say yes to the good that the Lord provides for us. That's just a general overview. I'll talk in the book more directly about specific things we can do, like, for example, limiting or cutting out smartphones in our family's lives. Things that are just as simple as that, but that absolutely have to be done if we're going to hold on to the faith. And we can talk about later about reasons why I feel so strongly about smartphones.
Well, and I certainly want to get to that because that's a section that I think would relate to a lot of the conversation we've had here at Point of View about the intrusive nature of some of this media. We've talked about the new media and some of those issues, but for just a minute, let's maybe come to one of the surprising chapters to me in the book, and that is, I know when I'll mention your name, matter of fact, even last week when I was promoting it, I had some people around the table that are kind of politically involved and kind of go, well, yeah, okay, that's a monastic movement. But you have chapter 4 here, a new kind of Christian politics. In other words, some people that have read your article and obviously haven't probably not read your book would think, well, this just means a complete retreat from society and a monastic kind of movement. But I don't really get that sense at all, especially when I read that chapter.
No, and thank you for saying that. That is the greatest misperception I have about this book, that people hear monastery and they think that I'm telling them to head for the hills. I'm not telling them to head for the hills because I believe as lay Christians we are called to be in the world. And most of us, even if we wanted to head for the hills, we have to live in the world because this is where we live and this is where our families are and our jobs are. What I'm saying is that if we Christians are going to be able to hold on to Christ and present the face of Christ to this world, to this post-Christian world, then we have to engage in strategic retreats in small ways in our everyday life. And politics is one of the ways of doing that. I think that, for so long, I'm 50 years old. I came of age politically under Ronald Reagan. And I remember back then that a lot of Christians believed that America was basically a moral country, but we were ruled by liberals who had thrown aside conservative morality, thrown aside the Christian faith. And if we only got good, solid Republicans and Christian men and women into office and into the judiciary, then everything would take care of itself. Well, it didn't work out that way. The culture continued to degrade, and we forgot, I believe, that politics is downstream from culture. And now we see the fruits of that. We see that even among people who profess Christianity, a lot of Christians accept same-sex marriage, for example, something that is completely incompatible with Christian orthodoxy. So what I'm saying to Christians today is not get out of politics. We have to stay involved in politics at some level, if only to protect religious liberty. What I'm saying, though, is put most of your emphasis on building up the local church, building up your classical Christian schools, building up the local community so we can be resilient when the politics of America turns against us. And it's doing that. A lot of Christians think that just because we elected Donald Trump, that, we dodged that bullet with Hillary Clinton. I agree we did dodge a bullet. But if Christians believe that Donald Trump is going to stop these currents that have been building for hundreds of years, these currents of secularization, they're dreaming. Even if Donald Trump were a saint, he couldn't stop this. I think that the election of Donald Trump gives us Christians a few years, 4, maybe 8 years, to prepare and to dig in for the great trials ahead.
If we can, Rod, for just a minute, let's talk about, too, the fact that now that the church has lost its kind of cultural respectability. You quote from Russell Moore, who's been on the program with us, from his book Onward, about that. It does kind of free you up a little bit. I've said before, when people will say, well, you're a Christian, that means you're a hater. Well, I say, well, you freed me up now because I can really say what I want, because I'm not trying to gain your attention. I'm not trying to gain your favor. I'm just going to tell you what I think. And there's a sense in which the church is no longer expected to be the center of the community. It's already seen as counterculture. And in some respects, the church always has been counterculture, but for a while we sort of seduced ourselves because of a civil religion to think that we were the center of the culture when we really weren't even at the time.
Right. You know, I think about one of the thinkers that led me to Christ as an adult, Søren Kierkegaard, the great Danish Lutheran theologian of the 19th century. He said that when everybody in a society is Christian, Christianity ceases to exist. Now, what's that paradox mean? It means that when everybody is a cultural Christian, then that acts as sort of a vaccination against taking the radical demands of the gospel seriously. I think in that way, this could be the thing that saves the church's soul, the idea that we are no longer, if you hold any kind of Orthodox Christian belief, especially on sexual matters, you're no longer respectable. You're an outcast. And that's really hard for a lot of people to accept, Kirby. And I think that's why some Christians who desperately want to be accepted by the greater culture, why they can't, they just rebel against this message I'm bringing them, because they really want to be accepted. That's not going to happen anymore, or if it happens, it's going to cost you too much. So I'm saying rejoice that they hate us, because they hated our Lord before us. And let's embrace our outsiderness and use that as a springboard to deepen our faith and to deepen our connection to each other and to prepare for what's coming.
Well, again, when we come back from the break, I'd like to speak to that issue a little bit, too, because you live in Louisiana and we're broadcasting today from Texas. But I spend a fair amount of my time in places like Vermont, which is the most secular state in the country, and Oregon, which is the second most secular one. In other words, there are very few churchgoers there. If you're a Christian, you sort of have to already accept that kind of premise, which is a little different than if you live in Louisiana. And so we'll talk about that in just a minute. But if you would like to know a little bit more about Rod Dreher, you can certainly find it on our website. Next to some of his bio, you will see a place where it sends you to the website, benedictoptionbook.com. So there's a place where you can get a copy, and it is now available, so I would encourage you to do that. We also, of course, would encourage you, if you wanted to listen to this again, you might want to download the podcast or even watch it later on our YouTube channel and pass it on to some others as we have this conversation. We're going to talk a little bit more about a church for all seasons, but also talk about what a Christian village might look like. And then we're going to get into some of those practical ideas. What about classical Christian education? What about those smartphones we were just talking about a minute ago? Lots of things to cover. And if you'd like to join us, I suspect this will be one where you want to just pretty much sit back and listen. But if you have a comment or a question, 1-800-351-1212. We'll continue our conversation about the Benedict Option right after this.
Imagine you work where you know people do not share your faith, and they certainly don't agree with a Christian view of life and culture. You are surrounded by hostility every single day. How important would it be to have solid information to back you up? Jim in South Carolina listens to Point of View in the afternoons. He writes, I teach in a public secular university and enjoy actually being a voice for the biblical Christian worldview in a liberal setting. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for being bold and proclaiming truth. And Jim finishes, I pray for you daily. Jim works in hostile territory, and he prays for Point of View because Point of View is a source of truth. Please help us continue being here for Jim and everyone else. We need you to visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151 and join the Truth Team. Enable us to be here each day by giving each month. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Rod Dreher as we talk about his book, The Benedict Option, A Strategy for Christians in a Post-Christian Nation. If you'd like to join us, you can, 1-800-351-1212, or else just sit back and listen as we talk about this book. 250 pages available in your local bookstore, but we have a link there as well. And Rod, let's, if we can, talk about maybe the difference in the way people might perceive this. You live in the land of Duck Dynasty. I've seen you quote Phil Robertson, so I know you know them. And there, they may be really respected people in Louisiana. my listeners in Oregon and Washington are thinking about how a couple that did not want to bake a cake for a lesbian wedding were put out of business, or this grandmother in Washington who is not only going to maybe lose her business, but even lose her own home. It is a little more obvious when you're at the corner of the countries to draw a line between Christianity and the world. But you live in a place where sometimes those lines are blurred a little bit more, and maybe there doesn't seem to be as much of a need for something like the Benedict Option. What have you found?
Well, that's really true, Kirby. In fact, I heard from a reader of my blog last night who says he lives in Austin, Texas, and he's a Reformed Christian, conservative, and he said that he's from a southern state, not Texas, but another southern state where Christianity is profoundly integrated into local cultural life. He came from a very strong evangelical church background, and most of his friends still live there, and they are reliving the life that their parents had. And he said they really don't see what's coming from the broader culture because they've never left there, and they live inside a bubble. He said, look, I've lived all over the country. I've lived in New York. I live now in liberal Austin, Texas, and I want to shout to my friends, this is coming for you too. But it's just so hard to wake people up when they assume that it's always going to be this way. Not long ago, a pastor friend of mine in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, told me that one of his parishioners came to him and said, Pastor, my daughter, she's a seventh grader in a public school, she came home and said, Mom, I'm a boy. I want you to call me a boy now. The mom said, I went to the guidance counselor to say, what in the world is going on with my daughter? And the guidance counselor said, ma'am, you just need to get on board with your son and treat your son with the dignity he deserves. This is happening in Louisiana, not in San Francisco, not in New York, not in Vermont or Portland, but Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It's coming faster than a lot of Christians think it is. And it's true that we live, and I'm blessed to live in Louisiana, in a place where people can be much more upfront about their faith. But I worry that sort of cultural Christianity serves as a vaccination against not only taking Christianity seriously, but taking the threats coming to us from the broader culture seriously. But it's going to hit so hard that believers aren't going to know what has come upside their head, to put it like we would back home in Louisiana.
Well, let's talk about families for just a minute. One of the quotes that you have in there is from Mary Eberstadt, who, by the way, has been on the program with us. And matter of fact, last week in our Millennial Roundtable, we were quoting from her, so it's interesting. But the argument that she makes, and the argument you make, and I think any argument, is the fate really of religion in America is tied to the fate of the family. And so in your chapter there and the idea of a Christian village, what you're talking about is you can turn your family into a monastery, not like in the real monastery, but the point is it's got to be a safe place. It's got to be a place where you disengage from this culture of modernism because the press on our culture today is so strong that if we don't have some resistance to it, we're going to just have nothing but casualties in our own family.
That's true, and I think one of the biggest trapdoors through which we let the enemy into our families is through technology, especially smartphones. I remember talking to a woman in my hometown who, we have a really good public school in my hometown, but my wife and I are homeschoolers, and when we moved back to our small southern town, we asked this Baptist woman, why are you homeschooling? Why did you take your kids out of the school? And she said when our fifth grade son came home from school and said that his friends, all his buddies, were watching hardcore pornography on their smartphones. Now, they weren't doing this at the school. The school wouldn't let them have phones, but they were still doing this. And I've seen even in conservative Christian schools, parents, they go to church on Sunday, they send their kids to youth group, they put their kids in a Christian school, and yet they hand them a smartphone, even as early as first grade, I've been told by some folks who are dealing with this. And they don't understand that they're undermining every single thing that they do and the church does and the Christian school does to form the hearts and minds of these children. The family is undermining it. When I go speak at Christian colleges and universities, whether it's Catholic or evangelical, the professors all say the same thing. These kids are coming to us today out of Christian homes and Christian churches knowing almost nothing about the faith and having not been formed in their hearts and the habits and the practices of Christianity, so that they are really no different from the kids in the world. And so they get here and they get hit by the world, and they think that holiness is the same thing as niceness. and they have no resistance to the broader anti-Christian culture.
Well said.
Yeah.
We got a number of people that want to ask questions about education, but let's at least get to Chapter 7 so you can put some things on the table. Education as a Christian formation, because that is key. What happens in the home, certainly number one. What happens in the schools, and oftentimes, of course, the education is in the home, but talk about that because, I think you've already sort of alluded to it, but what else should we begin to think about in terms of this idea of really changing the way in which we educate the next generation?
Sure. Well, I come out in the book as a big proponent of classical Christian education, which is to say Christian schooling that follows the classical model. And the big difference between ordinary Christian schooling and classical schooling has to do at basis with anthropology, which is to say, what is the person? And classical Christian schooling is about forming the entire person, not simply giving them information that they need to be good consumers and good members of middle-class society, plus putting a little Jesus sauce on top. Now, this is about going deep down into the heart of what it means to be a human being and raising kids up to put Christ at the center of things. And it's really radical and countercultural, but this movement is growing by leaps and bounds because I think a lot of Christians are seeing that the schools themselves, even ordinary Christian schools that mean well, are not forming our kids. They are allowing our kids to be conformed to the world. And this rabbi, Mark Gottlieb, an Orthodox Jewish rabbi, told me, he said, you Christians have got to start taking education more seriously because that is at the center of our renewal and the center of holding on to your faith, and as for Christians, the center of Christian renewal. Yeah. It can't be separated out, compartmentalized from our life, a separation between religion and education. They have to be deeply integrated.
I've been on some of these accreditation boards over the years with ACSI and others, and there is all the difference in the world between a Christian school, which is rooted in the Bible, really teaches Christian worldview, and tries to make sure it's applied to every discipline, versus a school that is Christian in name only, maybe opens in prayer, maybe has chapel, but really isn't that much different than the school down the street. So, again, that's something that parents need to pay attention to. But this one generated lots of phone calls, so let me see if I can take at least a few phone calls before we take a break. We'll head to Michigan first, WLJN. John, thank you for joining us. You're on with Rod Dreher.
Thank you, Kirby, and thank you, Rod, too. I wanted to call to thank Rod for being willing to have his write his article that was published on the Fox opinion page, because Rod, I go to Fox a lot. It's one of the more open comment sections for different kinds of articles. Todd Starnes publishes them, and there's a lot of comment there. And I spend a lot of time in debate with the secularists of different varieties on there. I appreciate you doing that, and I would hope that Fox would actually solicit more of your type of articles. But also, I wanted to ask if you think, is this not a time for the Christian community to really turn a corner and abandon the government education system, to build schools in local communities whereby parents and grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles get together with the church leaders and congregations to build an entirely separate system, which can be the classical Christian education alternative to help, hopefully, prepare this generation or the coming generation and the successive generations to be the possible light on the hill that we need in our nation.
Let me take a break, and when we come back, we'll give Rod a chance to answer that question. We have a couple of others who want to talk about education, and again, that's just one of the many chapters in the book, so let me commend it to you, 250 pages, but it does talk about a new kind of politics, a church for all seasons, the idea of a Christian village, education as Christian formation, some that we probably won't get to, preparing for hard labor, the whole idea of a Christian counterculture, and some other issues as well. So we'll come back and try to respond to that, as well as we have a few other calls here, and we'll do our best to give as many of you a chance to join the conversation. Rod Dreher with us as we talk about his book, The Benedict Option. We'll come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Maria Nolan and St. Anne Catholic School had a falling out. Nolan thinks her religious employer fired her from her job as principal of the school for speaking out against what she viewed as racial discrimination. The Diocese of Birmingham, Alabama, that operates St. Anne's, said that Nolan simply wasn't the right person to advance their religious mission. Nolan's responsibilities were pretty clear. As principal, she was responsible for implementing an educational atmosphere charged with the Catholic beliefs of her employer. That included monitoring lesson plans to make sure the teaching of the church was reflected in the lessons of the classroom, leading school prayers, and organizing religious activities for the students and the faculty. The court quickly determined that there was little doubt that Nolan's role as principal falls within the general ambit of the ministerial exception. Although she lacked the formal title of minister, her role clearly conveyed the church's message and carried out its mission. Therefore, the court could not interfere with what amounts to a decision by a religious body as to who best perpetuates its religious message and mission. The ministerial exception is an important doctrine that protects the unique aspects of a religious employer, giving relief to religious organizations from the rigors of employment law that may hamper their unique religious mission. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Rod Dreher with us as we talk about his book, The Benedict Option, a strategy for Christians in a post-Christian nation. And Rod, what about this idea of moving away from the public schools where our tax dollars still go to the government schools and we'll always have young people there? But what I hear you saying is that if you can get into a classical Christian school, great. If you can create one, that would be great. If you can't, consider homeschooling. And those are some things we talked about in the first hour, and that seems to be what you talk about in this book as well.
That's true, because I believe that education has got to be at the center of building resilient Christian communities and Christian families that will be able to hold on to the faith and evangelize, frankly, in this dark age to come, this post-Christian age we're in now. And I think that the classical model is just fantastic because, as I said earlier, it focuses on educating the whole person. It's not simply about this utilitarian model that even a lot of Christian schools today use, the idea that education is all about inputting information into the heads of kids, having them regurgitate it to pass the test so they can get certified and go out and get a good job. Nothing wrong with getting a good job, but that's not education. Education in the classical view is forming the whole person. And if you're a Christian, that means forming the whole person to Christ. I believe that we have to have the church deeply involved with our schools and in a real way, not just simply to sort of give it a Christian gloss, but at the very heart of what we teach. In Baton Rouge, where I live, there's a school called Sequitur Classical Academy. That's what our kids are involved in, and it's mostly evangelical, but there are, as an Orthodox family, ours and a Catholic family there, and we all agree. We don't agree on the same church, but we all agree on the classical message. And I think that the thing that we need to do as believers is make it more possible for working class people who don't have a choice because they can't afford classical school. We need to make it possible for them to put their kids in these schools too. And that's one way churches can get involved with the local community. And frankly, Kirby, this is a political act. If politics is about how we live in common together for the common good, I would rather see my money go to building up classical Christian schools locally than go into paying for a donation for a candidate to go off into Washington.
Yeah, and again, we've talked about even trying to develop more of those with online learning so that even if you're in an isolated area, because we have listeners in Maine and Alaska and places like that where the chances of putting together a classical Christian school are slim and none. So we even tried to develop that a couple of years ago. But let me take another phone call because this one relates also to this issue of public schools. So we'll go to Texas this time. Lance, thank you for joining us. You're on with Rod Dreher.
Yeah, thanks for taking my call. I think your guest is dead on about public schools. In my opinion, we homeschool, but my opinion is unless we abolish public schools and take the money away from them, our country is going, their new religion in our country, and it's already kind of majority, I would say, is going to be secular humanism. And true Christianity is going to be a fringe. And I would even say that Bible-believing Christianity right now is a fringe in America, and it's only going to get worse. So my opinion is that the public school needs to be radically changed. The money needs to be taken away from them, or we're going to be, like I said, secular humanists. Thank you.
Okay. Any comments, Rod?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would be happier with a voucher system where to give parents more choice, but we have to be realistic about this. The public schools are going to remain for the foreseeable future. And people like in my hometown, the public school is the center of the community, and it's a good public school as these things go. But I think that we expect too much of public schools. My late sister, Ruthie Lemming, I wrote a book about her, The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming. Mm-hmm. She was a public school teacher who believed powerfully and profoundly in public education. But I can remember her telling me that back in the 90s when she first started, she said they expect us to do so much, we teachers. You know, these kids come from so many broken families, and society dumps all of its problems on the teacher and expects teachers and schools to fix them. The public schools can never be better than the public itself is. So I don't have a problem in principle with public schools, but as our country becomes more and more secular, and as we have bureaucrats in Washington, like the Obama administration tried to do, forcing transgender mandates on public schools, I mean, that's outrageous. And thank God Trump overturned that, but don't think it's going to go away. The next time we get a Democrat in, it's coming back.
Well, and back to what Lance was talking about here, how Christianity is perceived. You know, even at the turn of the century, a J. Gresham Machen that was warning that there could be a time in which Christianity would be regarded as nothing more than a harmless delusion. Well, I'd have to say, Rod, now it's perceived by a lot of people as a harmful delusion. And so this is, again, one of the arguments for the Benedict option, isn't it?
It really is. And I think what happens is when our kids get out into the public square, when they go to college, when they get out to try to find work, if they are any sort of what I call a small O Orthodox Christian, which is a Bible-believing Christian who holds to historic Christian orthodoxy, they're going to face shunning. What's going to happen to them when they can't get into medical school because they refuse to do abortions or transgender surgery, and on and on and on? We have got to prepare our kids to be Shadrachs, Meshachs, and Abednegos who are willing to be in the public square to serve the public, but not at the expense of apostasy. And I think right now so many Christians don't take this seriously enough, and so we're preparing kids who go out into the public square and will be willing to compromise for the sake of social acceptance. This is not going to last.
Let's, if we can, take a few more phone calls here. And if you would like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll head to Alabama. Ken, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Kirby. Two quick questions, and I'll just hang up and listen. Is your guest familiar with the work of Dr. Duke Pesta, trying to educate people about the problems with the Common Core system? And number two, what would your guest think if Mr. Trump were to completely close the Department of Education, which I think he has alluded to that he might try to do, which would turn it back to the states? And I'll just hang up and listen. Thank you.
You know, again, you grew up during the Reagan era. I'm a little bit older than you, and I remember when there was a real talk to try to close the Department of Education. But then you had Bill Bennett in there, and you had Gary Bauer says, we might keep it going. But what about this, a Common Core and even closing down in the Department of Education?
Well, I don't know the work of Dr. Duke Pesta, and frankly, I don't know enough about Common Core itself to comment knowledgeably about it, because our kids have never been in public school. We've been homeschoolers and classical Christian schoolers. But as far as the Department of Education goes, I think that's right. We should close it down. Education is a state responsibility, and I believe in federalism, actual, real federalism. Let the state of Louisiana, the state of Alabama, the state of Texas educate our kids as we want to do it, and let the state of New York, Vermont, and Oregon do what they want to do. But this bureaucracy in Washington, this idea that a central bureaucracy is going to be able to dictate or manage education policy for the whole nation, it's nuts. And I'll tell you what, when these people get to Washington, Betsy DeVos, the current education secretary, she is a very wealthy Christian who is pro-LGBT. And I think this is a class issue as well. I don't think that people like her have any problem with this sort of thing. She wanted to keep the transgender ruling from the directive from the Obama administration in place, and Jeff Sessions wouldn't let her, and God bless Jeff Sessions for that. But I think that even people who say they're Christians, who are very high up in society and in the government and in the establishment, we can't necessarily count them as allies.
That's true. And again, on Common Core, since Ken was asking about that, I just did a quick search on our website. We have about 30 different either articles or interviews we've done on that. So if that's something you want to know some more about, go to our website, pointofview.net. Rod, it has been a pleasure to have you on the program. We appreciate seeing all the things that you write, and we appreciate this new book, The Benedict Option. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kirby, it's been a pleasure. And remember, man, all of us Christians are in this together. We're going to need each other through what's coming.
Rod Dreher, again, the Benedict Option, a strategy for Christians in a post-Christian nation. You can find more information on our website, pointofview.net. Again, that's all we have for today. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. Visit our website, pointofview.net. You're going to find some great material that I think you can use there, and I hope that you appreciated these conversations. We look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.